started one Sunday evening, a regular, boring Sunday like hundreds before it. I was sitting in my recliner, watching some meaningless show that I couldn't even tell you the name of, while Judy was pretending to clean up the dishes. She wasn't doing much of anything, just clanking plates around to make it seem like she was busy. I knew she'd be back to her phone in a minute, scrolling through God knows what. And then, out of nowhere, I felt it. A sharp, electric urge. A thrill I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not lust, but something darker. I looked at her and felt it bubble up inside me. The need to make her do something. Something she didn't want to do. A twist of power, control. And not the kind of control you get by raising your voice or making demands. I wanted to crack her open from the inside, pull out that bitterness she's been harboring, and use it. She turned around from the kitchen, holding a dish towel, and gave me one of her half-smiles. The kind of smile she thought would pass as polite. But I could see the years of resentment hiding behind it, the edge in her eyes from all the arguments we never finished. It made my pulse quicken, just looking at her like that. I had to push. I had to see where this could go. "Why don't you stop pretending to care about this place and admit you've checked out, Judy?" I said, my voice low but biting. She froze. She wasn't used to that tone from me. Sure, we'd had our spats over the years, but I always let her win. This was different. There was something new in my voice. It wasn't anger. It was something else entirely, and she sensed it. Slowly, she turned around, setting the dish towel down, and raised an eyebrow. "What's your problem tonight?" she asked, her voice dripping with her usual annoyance, but I could see her trying to gauge me. My problem? I stood up from my chair, a strange kind of energy flowing through me as I closed the gap between us. "You think I don't notice how you've been acting? Like you're too good for all of this now. Like you've got some secret life outside of me." She snorted, brushing me off like she always did. But I didn't back down. "Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about." And there it was, the first crack in her mask. A flicker of doubt. She was trying to piece together where I was going with this. But she had no clue. She never expected me to confront her like this, not after all these years. But I wasn't about to stop. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "You think I haven't noticed the way you look at other men? How you flirt with that guy at the grocery store? The one who always bags your groceries just a little too slow." She blinked, stunned. "What are you? You like the attention, don't you?" I said, cutting her off, my words sliding in like a knife. "You think I haven't seen the way you eat it up? But here's the thing, Judy, I like it too." Her face twisted, confusion mixing with anger. "You've lost your mind." "Maybe," I said, stepping even closer, until I could practically feel her breath on my face. "Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending. Maybe I want to see how far you're willing to go when someone else is watching." I could see it now, the fear in her eyes. Not because of what I was saying, but because a part of her knew I was right. There was something between us, something rotten and twisted, and I was finally calling it out. And I wasn't going to let her wriggle away from it. "You think I didn't notice you giving that little wink to the neighbor? Or how you laugh just a little too much when he talks? Judy, you're not as subtle as you think. You're insane," she snapped, her voice rising with the panic that was creeping in. "That's ridiculous." But I could tell she was rattled, and that only made me push harder. "Am I?" I asked, smirking. "Or are you just scared I'm onto something? Because here's the deal, Judy. I've been watching, and I like what I've seen. I like the way you act when you think I'm not paying attention. But we're not going to play this game in secret anymore. We're doing this out in the open. I'm going to be the one pulling the strings now." The silence between us was deafening. She didn't say a word, but her eyes told me everything. She wasn't in control anymore. And for the first time in years, I felt alive that I stood there, inches from her, and watched as the fire in Judy's eyes flickered. She opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it just as quickly, realizing there was no point in the usual snide remarks. I had her pinned, cornered by her own secrets, and we both knew it. The silence between us was like a coiled spring, ready to snap. "You think you can just say this crap to me?" she finally hissed, her voice shaky but still holding on to that edge of defiance. "What, you've been keeping score? Watching my every move like some kind of creep?" "Creep," I said with a laugh, shaking my head slowly. No, you're missing the point, Judy. I've enjoyed watching. Enjoyed seeing how you squirm when you think I'm too old, too blind to notice. But what if I told you that it doesn't bother me? That I like it when you pretend you're still wanted by other men? She stared at me, disbelief spreading across her face. What kind of sick game is this? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let my words hang in the air, thick with the weight of what I was about to suggest. Her hand, still clutching the dish towel, was trembling now. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. But this was no longer her game to play. Let's cut to the chase, I said, leaning back slightly, my tone casual as if we were talking about something as mundane as the weather. You like attention. You like playing this little dance with these men, pretending it's harmless. So why not take it a step further? Her eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. What if, I continued, I told you that you could have your fun with my blessing? What if I told you that I want to see you with another man? Not behind my back, not in secret, but because I tell you to. Her face flushed deep red, a mix of embarrassment, anger, and something else. Her lips parted, but she was at a loss for words. She was trying to find the outrage to lash out at me, but the rawness of my suggestion had her frozen. You're insane, she finally whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. Maybe, I said, the smirk on my face only growing. Or maybe I just know you better than you think. Maybe I see right through all those little lies you tell yourself. How many times have you looked at someone and wondered what it would be like if they touched you? If they made you feel something again? Her breath hitched. That's when I knew I had struck gold. She wouldn't admit it, not yet, but the crack in her defenses was getting wider. You're disgusting, she spat, but there was no real venom behind it. It was more reflex than anything else. She was trying to regain her footing, but I wasn't about to let her. Am I asked, raising an eyebrow. Or are you just scared of how much you actually want it? There it was again, that flicker of doubt in her eyes. She opened her mouth to fire back, but the words never came. Instead, she turned away, retreating toward the kitchen counter, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I took a slow step forward, enjoying the shift in power. She wasn't the sharp-tongued Judy now. She wasn't in control of this conversation, or of anything that was happening. And I knew that deep down, a part of her was tempted, whether she wanted to admit it or not. You don't have to hide it from me, I said softly, almost gently. I'm giving you permission. No more sneaking around in your head. No more guilt. Just think about it, Judy. The freedom, the thrill. Shut up, she muttered. But her voice was so small, so fragile. I wasn't going to shut up. Not now. I stepped closer, until I was standing just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of my words on the back of her neck. Imagine it. You on your knees. Not just for me, but for another man. Maybe two. And me, watching it all. Telling you exactly what to do. She spun around so fast, I barely saw it coming. Her hand lashed out and slapped me across the face. Her eyes wild with a mix of fury and disbelief. You're disgusting, she said again, louder this time, her voice shaking. But I didn't flinch. I didn't move an inch. I just stood there, feeling the sting of the slap fade, and smiled. She could hit me all she wanted, but she couldn't undo what I had planted in her mind. That seed of doubt, of curiosity. We'll see, I said simply, locking eyes with her. We'll see how long you can resist. Her face was flushed, her breathing uneven, and I could see the turmoil playing out inside her. She wanted to hate me, to scream at me, to storm out of the room and never look back. But something was holding her there, rooted to the spot. Something that neither of us could deny. I turned around, heading back to my recliner, leaving her standing there in the kitchen, clutching the counter like her life depended on it. I didn't need to push any further. Not tonight, because I knew I had already won. The game had begun and she was in it whether she wanted to admit it or not. The next few days were tense, to say the least. Judy was quiet, but not in her usual annoyed way. It was something deeper, something simmering beneath the surface. I could see it in the way she moved around the house, her shoulders stiff, her eyes avoiding mine, her lips pressed into that tight, thin line that told me she was thinking about what I said. about the twisted idea I'd planted in her. Every time I looked at her, I could feel that silent battle she was having with herself. The disgust she wanted to feel toward me, toward the entire situation, was there, but it wasn't alone. There was something else too, and I knew what it was. She was curious. No matter how much she hated the thought, I could sense the pull it had on her. The cracks were showing, and I knew exactly how to exploit them. It was Thursday evening. The house was quiet, and I could tell she'd been thinking about it all day. Her hands moved slowly as she folded laundry on the bed, but her mind was elsewhere, I could tell. She wasn't humming to herself like she usually did. She wasn't asking me where I'd put my socks or nagging me about some small chore I hadn't done. No, tonight, she was fully wrapped up in that dark corner of her mind. I waited until she finished the last shirt, then walked into the room casually, acting as if I wasn't about to stir things up again. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment, letting the tension thicken between us. "Judy," I said, my voice low but deliberate. She froze, her hands still holding a folded towel. She didn't look at me right away, but I could see the way her shoulders tensed at the sound of my voice. She knew what was coming. "You've been quiet these past few days," I continued, taking a step into the room. "Still thinking about what we talked about?" "I don't want to talk about it," she muttered, barely above a whisper. "But that's the thing, Judy," I said, moving closer. "We're going to talk about it. You don't get to ignore this. Not after what we both know is happening in that pretty little head of yours." She slammed the towel down on the bed and whirled around to face me, her eyes blazing. "You think I'm just going to, what? Give in to this sick fantasy of yours? Let you parade me around in front of other men like I'm some kind of toy?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, letting her anger roll off me like water off a duck's back. "You think it's just my fantasy?" She blinked, thrown off by my calmness. "What the hell are you talking about? You've already considered it," I said, taking another step closer, my voice low and almost teasing. "Don't lie to me, Judy. I know you've thought about it. Maybe not with the same words, maybe not in exactly the way I described, but you've imagined it. What it would feel like to have that kind of freedom again. To have someone new looking at you like you're still desirable. To feel that thrill, that power." Her breath caught in her throat, and I saw her eyes flicker with doubt. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. "Not completely. You think you've got me figured out, huh?" she said, her voice trembling just a little, trying to regain her footing. "You think I'm just some sad old woman desperate for attention?" "I think," I said slowly, taking one last step until I was right in front of her, "that you've been living a lie for years, pretending like you're still satisfied. But we both know you're not." She stared at me, her face a mixture of anger, fear, and something else, something darker. I could see her resolve crumbling, piece by piece, even though she tried to stand firm. "Why don't we stop pretending?" I said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She flinched at the touch, but she didn't pull away. "You've wanted this for longer than you're willing to admit." "I don't want anything to do with this," she hissed, though her voice was losing its conviction. "No." I leaned in closer, my lips just inches from her ear. "Then why haven't you walked away? Why haven't you told me to stop? You could have, Judy. You could have ended this the second I brought it up. But here you are." I could feel the heat radiating off her, her breath shallow and quick. She was cornered, both by me and by her own thoughts. She wanted to push me away, but something held her there, and we both knew what it was. "I don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't want this. You're lying to yourself," I murmured, my hand resting lightly on her waist. "But you don't have to lie to me." I pulled back slightly, just enough to look her in the eyes. There was a storm behind them now, a wild, confused mess of emotions. She was furious, ashamed, desperate to hold on to whatever scrap of dignity she had left. But beneath all of that, buried deep in the wreckage of her crumbling facade, was a flicker of something else. Something she couldn't hide from me anymore. "Let me prove it to you," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Let me show you what it feels like, to give in, to let go." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She was on the edge, teetering between what she thought she was supposed to feel and what she really wanted. And then, After what felt like an eternity, she gave me the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. That was all I needed. "I'll set it up," I said, stepping back, my heart racing with a strange kind of exhilaration. "You just need to be ready." She didn't say a word. She just stood there, staring at the floor, her entire body tense and trembling. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her fears, and the realization of what was coming next. This was no longer just a game. The day I'd been waiting for came quicker than either of us expected. I'd been careful, methodical, reaching out to a couple of guys I knew would be open to this sort of thing. It wasn't hard, really. The younger generation is always looking for a thrill, something to spice up their predictable lives. A couple of messages here, a few vague promises there, and I had them hooked before they even knew what they were walking into. But Judy? She was a different story. In the days leading up to it, she didn't say a word about what had happened between us. Not a single mention of that night in the bedroom, or the deal that was now hanging over her head. She kept to herself, quieter than usual, like she was trying to shrink into the background, hoping I'd let it go. But I wasn't letting anything go. Not now. I could see the weight of it pressing on her. The way she'd pause in the middle of her day, her eyes distant, like she was trying to figure out how to handle what was coming. She wanted to avoid it, to pretend that conversation had never happened. But I wasn't going to give her that escape. Not after everything I'd set in motion. Thursday evening rolled around again, and I knew it was time. The guys were already on their way, clueless about the storm I was about to drop them into. They thought it was just going to be some wild night, something they'd laugh about later. Little did they know, they were stepping into a much more twisted scene than they could have imagined. And Judy? She was the main event. I found her in the kitchen again, her back to me, scrubbing the counter like it would somehow erase what was about to happen. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, savoring the tension. She had no idea what I had planned for tonight, but she must have known something was coming. "Judy?" I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. She didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders stiffen, her hand stopping mid-scrub. "It's time," I said simply, stepping into the room. She froze, her hand gripping the sponge so tightly I thought it might tear apart. For a few long seconds, she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like she was trying to will herself invisible. "You don't get to run from this," I continued, my voice steady, almost casual. "We made a deal. You nodded, remember? Now it's time to keep your end of the bargain." Finally, she turned around, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You can't be serious," she whispered, though we both knew I was. "I told you I'd set it up," I said, my eyes locking onto hers. "And I did. They'll be here soon." "They?" Her voice cracked on the word, and I could see the panic flooding her now. "You? What do you mean they? You didn't think I'd just have you do this with one guy, did you?" I said with a slow, deliberate smile. "No, Judy. You're going to be shared. That's part of the fun, isn't it? It's what you secretly wanted all along." Her face went white, her body trembling as the full weight of my words hit her. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," I said, stepping closer, my voice cold and firm. "You're going to, because you know deep down it's already started in your head. You've been thinking about it, imagining it. And tonight, you're going to live it." She was shaking her head again, tears starting to form in her eyes, but I didn't stop, couldn't. I was too deep into it now, too locked into this twisted thrill to let her pull away. I reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her close, my voice lowering to a whisper. "You're going to kneel, Judy. For me. And for them. You're going to do it because I told you to. And because you know, in some sick part of you, that this is what you deserve." She pulled back, trying to resist, but I held her firm. "You think you can still back out?" I asked, my grip tightening. "After everything we've been through? After the way you've looked at me these past few days, knowing what's coming? You're already in this, Judy. You've already agreed." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't fight me anymore. Not really. She was too far gone now, too torn between her shame and the dark curiosity I'd awakened in her. I could see it, the war playing out behind her eyes. The part of her that wanted to scream, to break free, was losing. Slowly, surely, it was losing. Go upstairs, I said, releasing her wrist and stepping back, giving her space to make her choice. Get yourself ready. They'll be here in 15 minutes. She stood there, staring at me, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. For a moment, I thought she might actually try to run, to bolt out the front door and leave me standing there, alone with my twisted fantasies. But she didn't. She stayed. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the kitchen. Her footsteps heavy, slow, like each step was dragging her deeper into the hell I'd created for her. I watched her go, feeling that rush of power surge through me again. I gave her a few minutes to collect herself, to come to terms with what was about to happen. Then, I made my way upstairs. When I entered the bedroom, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her face a blank mask of resignation. She didn't look up as I walked in, didn't say a word. They're almost here, I said, standing in front of her, looking down at the woman who'd been my wife for all these years. You know what you need to do. She nodded, barely, just a tiny, broken gesture of acknowledgement. I reached down and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet my gaze. Good. Now get on your knees. She hesitated for only a second, then slowly slid off the bed, her legs shaking as she lowered herself to the floor. There she was, on her knees before me, her eyes filled with a mixture of dread and something else, something that sent a thrill running through me. I made my grandmother suck on her knees for me and 2 other young guys. That's what I told myself as I watched her there, helpless, broken, and exactly where I wanted her. A knock echoed through the house. The guys had arrived. And Judy? She was about to learn exactly what it meant to be mine. The knock echoed through the house, sharp and final. It was like the tolling of a bell, signaling that the moment I'd crafted was finally here. Judy flinched at the sound, still on her knees in front of me, her entire body trembling. I could see it now, the real fear settling in, the realization that there was no turning back. She was about to be thrown into something far beyond anything she'd ever imagined, and no amount of last-minute regret could save her. I took a step back, savoring the sight of her, broken and terrified, but not enough to get up and run. No, she was still there. She was still mine. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was happening, and that sent a thrill through me that I couldn't describe. I wasn't angry, I wasn't jealous. This was something darker, more primal, a hunger for control. And tonight I'd have it. I'll get the door, I said, my voice cool and calm, like nothing out of the ordinary was about to happen. Judy didn't move. She stayed on the floor, frozen, her hands gripping the bedpost as if it were her last tether to any kind of sanity. I could feel her eyes burning into my back as I left the room, but she didn't say a word. She didn't beg. She didn't protest. I made my way down the stairs, taking my time. Let her stew in her own fear for a few minutes longer. Let her understand exactly what she was about to face. The 2 guys I'd lined up for this were waiting on the porch, both of them standing there with casual confidence, like they had no idea what kind of twisted night they were about to walk into. They were young, early 30s maybe, full of the kind of cocky energy that made them perfect for this. I could see the curiosity in their eyes, the eagerness for something different. They thought this was just going to be a fun, wild experience, something they'd laugh about later with their friends. They had no idea. Come on in, I said, opening the door wide, letting them step into my world. She's upstairs. The taller one, Rick, I think his name was, looked at me with a smirk. So, how's this going to work? You'll see, I said, closing the door behind them. Just follow my lead. They followed me up the stairs, their footsteps heavy on the wood, anticipation thick in the air. As we reached the landing, I could feel the tension building inside me, the sense that everything was about to explode into something neither of them, and especially not Judy, was ready for. I could hear her shallow breathing from the hallway, the quiet sound of someone bracing themselves for a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. I opened the bedroom door, revealing her still on her knees, staring at the floor, her body stiff with fear and humiliation. The guys paused for a moment, taken aback by the sight of her like that. This wasn't exactly the confident, flirtatious woman they might have been expecting. No, Judy was already broken, and that shift in the power dynamic was something they didn't see coming. But I did. I wanted it. This is Judy, I said, stepping into the room behind them, my voice low and controlled. "And tonight, she's yours." Rick exchanged a look with his friend, Jason, and they both smirked. They weren't used to being handed something like this, something so vulnerable and ready. I could see the excitement light up in their eyes, that sense of power and dominance taking hold. Judy looked up for the first time since we'd entered the room. Her eyes were wide, full of tears she hadn't yet shed, and she met my gaze with something between desperation and pleading. It was the look of someone who wanted, more than anything, for this to stop, but knew it wouldn't, couldn't. "Go on, Judy," I said, stepping forward until I was standing directly in front of her. "Show them what you can do. This is your moment." For a second, it looked like she might break, like she might finally snap and scream, beg me to stop, plead for some scrap of mercy. But instead, she just closed her eyes, as if resigning herself to the inevitable. Her body was trembling, and her hands clutched the hem of her dress, wringing it tightly between her fingers. I bent down and tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at me. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you. Understand?" She didn't answer, just nodded. A small, broken gesture. That was all I needed. "Good," I said, standing up straight, turning to face Rick and Jason, who were now watching with a kind of eager curiosity. They were waiting for their cue, waiting for me to set the stage for the twisted spectacle they were about to be a part of. And I wasn't about to disappoint. "Kneel in front of them," I commanded, my voice sharp. Judy's eyes flicked to the two men, fear and shame flooding her face, but she didn't hesitate. Slowly, painfully, she crawled forward on her hands and knees, positioning herself directly in front of Rick and Jason. Her movements were slow, deliberate, every inch of her body radiating humiliation and defeat. But she did it. She obeyed. I watched as she knelt there, her hands shaking as she reached out toward Rick, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was thick with tension, the kind that chokes you, suffocates you. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" I whispered, my voice dark and low, as I stepped up behind her. "To be degraded like this? To be used in front of me, by men who don't care about you?" Judy's hands faltered for a moment, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She was too far gone, too trapped in the web I'd spun for her. I leaned in closer, my breath hot against her ear. "You're going to give them exactly what they want, and you're going to do it with a smile." I stepped back, letting the scene play out in front of me, a twisted sense of satisfaction curling in my chest. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. Judy looked up at Rick, her lips parting as she prepared herself for the act that would break the last piece of her dignity. And then, just as her hands touched his belt, she stopped. Her entire body froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd found some last shred of resistance, some final ounce of strength to stand up, to refuse, to walk away from the nightmare I'd trapped her in. But then, she lowered her head, and did exactly what I told her to do. The room seemed to grow colder as Judy lowered her head. I could see her resolve finally crumbling, her will dissolving in front of me like fragile glass dropped from a height. She wasn't the same sharp-tongued woman anymore, the one who used to snap back at me, lie with a sly smile, and think she had the upper hand in everything. That woman was gone. In her place was something hollow, something broken. And I had done that. I had turned her into this. Rick and Jason stood there, momentarily caught off guard by the weight of what was happening. Sure, they were expecting a good time, maybe even something wild, but this? They hadn't signed up for the raw brutality of this kind of power dynamic. But now, with Judy on her knees in front of them, trembling, they didn't say a word. The thrill had already hooked them too, drawing them deeper into my twisted game. I could see it in their eyes. The shift from confusion to excitement, the realization that they were about to be part of something dark, something they'd never forget. Rick looked down at Judy, a smirk creeping onto his face as he undid his belt with slow, deliberate movements. Jason followed his lead, standing back slightly, watching the scene unfold with that same hunger, that same cruel curiosity. Judy's hands shook violently as she reached for Rick's waistband, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. I stood there, not moving, barely even breathing, as I watched her humiliation reach its peak. The room was deadly silent except for the faint rustling of fabric and the sound of Judy's shallow breathing. "Look at me," I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick air. She hesitated, her body stiff, but after a second, her tear-filled eyes met mine. The rawness of her expression was a sight I would never forget. Her face a mixture of fear, shame, and a hint of something even darker, something that sent a thrill through me. "Smile," I ordered, the word hanging in the air like a taunt. Her lips twitched, barely moving, but she forced them into the smallest, most broken smile I'd ever seen. It was pathetic, really, half a grimace, half a plea for mercy. But it was enough. She was following my every command now, just as I had planned. Rick's smirk widened as he stepped closer, positioning himself in front of her, relishing in the control he'd just been handed. Jason stood back, arms crossed, watching with eager eyes, waiting his turn. This was exactly what I wanted. To see her like this, to watch her be reduced to nothing, not just in private but in front of these younger men who couldn't care less about her. I could see Judy's eyes glaze over, her mind retreating somewhere far away as she prepared herself for what came next. But just as her hands started to move, something in me shifted. The room felt different all of a sudden, colder than before, like the gravity of what was happening finally settled in. The tension had built so much that it felt unbearable, suffocating. For a second, just a flicker, I felt it, doubt, a crack in my own twisted satisfaction. Watching her like this, seeing her stripped of everything, I realized the full weight of what I had done. But that doubt, it wasn't enough to stop me. Not now. The darkness had gone too deep, sunk its claws in too far. I crossed a line there was no coming back from, and I wasn't alone. "Go on," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Make them happy. Show them exactly what you're good for." Judy's tears started to spill, quietly, down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. Her hands moved forward, shaking, as she undid the last button on Rick's pants. Her body was moving, but her spirit? That was gone. It killed it. I could see it in her eyes, the light had gone out. As she began, something unexpected happened. Jason, who had been standing back, smirking with that same hunger, suddenly shifted. He looked at me, then at Judy, and for a split second I saw it, hesitation. His smirk faltered, his brow furrowed, as if something about this was finally sinking in for him too. Is she okay with this?" he asked, his voice quiet, but the words hung heavy in the air. Rick's movements paused, just for a second, glancing over at Jason, but not stopping completely. The moment was tense, unexpected. Jason, clearly unsure, looked down at Judy again, then back to me. "You told us she was into this man?" Jason continued, his voice a bit firmer now, the confidence from earlier fading. "She doesn't look like she's into this." For a second, I said nothing. My pulse quickened, anger simmering beneath the surface. Who were they to question what was happening here? This was my show, my control. I had orchestrated every second of this night, every cruel detail, and they were guests in this twisted play. "She's fine," I snapped, glaring at Jason. "She knows exactly what's happening. This is what she agreed to." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. Jason didn't look convinced. He wasn't smiling anymore. And now, even Rick, who had been fully committed to the act, seemed to falter. The room, once filled with anticipation, had shifted into something else. The energy was off. What I had built was starting to slip. I could feel it, the tension breaking, the control loosening. My stomach tightened as the realization hit me. This wasn't going as smoothly as I'd imagined. "Look," Jason said, stepping back. I'm not trying to kill the vibe or anything, but this doesn't feel right, man." Rick, clearly less conflicted but still thrown by Jason's sudden change in tone, stepped back too, glancing between us. The weight of the moment was crushing now, the silence unbearable. "She's not saying anything," Jason continued, gesturing toward Judy, who was still on her knees, tears falling steadily now. "I mean, is she really okay with this?" Judy's head was down, her hair hiding her face, but her body shook with quiet sobs. And for the first time since I had set this whole thing in motion, a cold, sinking feeling twisted in my gut. I stared at her, trying to will myself to feel the same thrill I had moments ago. But it was gone. The power I had felt, the control, it was slipping away, evaporating into the cold air of the room. "Get up, Judy," I said, my voice low but lacking the authority I'd had before. "Get up." She didn't move. She couldn't. And as the silence stretched on, I realized that the night had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. What had started as a dark fantasy, a twisted game of power and control, had spiraled into something that none of us had expected. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I had done pressing down on me like a boulder, suffocating. And in that moment, the thrill was gone. Everything was gone. The silence was unbearable. Judy still knelt there, her body shaking, her tears falling in slow, steady drops onto the floor. The room, once thick with anticipation and the twisted excitement I had felt in controlling her, now felt suffocating. Too small, too dark, too full of something I hadn't anticipated. Regret. Jason stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his eyes flickering between me and Judy with growing discomfort. His bravado had completely evaporated, replaced with a look that bordered on disgust. Rick, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably but was still closer to Judy, unsure of whether to step back fully or wait for a signal to continue. His smirk was gone, though, replaced by a frown of uncertainty. I could feel the power slipping through my fingers, the control I had worked so hard to build crumbling in front of me. And for the first time in this entire process, I felt something I hadn't expected: doubt. Not about the situation itself, but about me, about what I had become. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I had imagined something else entirely. A scene where I held all the cards, where Judy submitted fully, and these two guys played their roles without question. I had seen it all so clearly in my head. But now, reality was intruding, shattering the fantasy I had constructed, and the weight of it was crushing. Jason broke the silence first, his voice low and strained. "I don't know, man. This just doesn't feel right." He glanced down at Judy again, her sobs now soft but relentless, and his discomfort only deepened. "I think we're done here." Rick opened his mouth as if to argue but then closed it again, looking back at Judy, whose head was still bowed. His eyes flicked to me, searching for some kind of direction, but I had none to give. This was spiraling out of my control, and for the first time I wasn't sure how to handle it. "Judy," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I stepped forward, trying to regain that cold, commanding tone, but it sounded hollow even to me. "Get up." She didn't move. "Judy?" I repeated, louder this time, but my voice was more desperate than demanding. Still nothing. The guys stood there, awkward now, unsure whether to leave or wait for some kind of conclusion to this sick spectacle. The confidence they'd walked in with had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they were part of something far darker than they had bargained for. Jason shifted, clearly wanting to leave but hesitant to bolt without Rick. "Look, man, we didn't come here for whatever this is," he said, gesturing toward Judy. "We thought this was all, consensual." His words hit me harder than I expected. Consensual. I had told myself that Judy had agreed, that she had nodded, hadn't she? That this was all something she wanted, somewhere deep down. But looking at her now, broken and weeping on the floor, I couldn't lie to myself any longer. I had pushed her here. I had taken her to a place she never wanted to go, and I had enjoyed every second of it. Until now. "I'm done," Jason said firmly, stepping toward the door. "This is too much." Rick, still standing close to Judy, glanced down at her one last time before backing away slowly. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The look on his face was enough. This wasn't what he had signed up for, and now he was eager to leave, to wash his hands of the whole thing. "Let's go," Rick muttered, grabbing his jacket from the chair and heading for the door. I watched them leave, the front door closing with a soft click that echoed through the house like a final verdict. They were gone, and now it was just me and Judy, trapped in the aftermath of what I had created. I turned back to her, still on her knees, still shaking, still weeping quietly into the floor. The weight of it all crashed down on me then, the full, terrible realization of what I had done. The fantasy had dissolved, leaving behind only the bitter, hollow truth. I had broken her. Not just tonight, not just in this moment. Over years, slowly, Piece by piece, I had torn her apart, and now there was nothing left. Nothing left of the woman who used to be my wife. Nothing left of the life we had once shared. "Judy," I said softly, trying once again to reach her, but my voice felt small, insignificant. "Get up, please." She didn't move. I sank down to my knees in front of her, my hands shaking now, too, as I reached out to touch her arm. She flinched at the contact, pulling away from me like I was poison. And in that moment I realized I had become poison. Everything I had done, everything I had pushed her into had corroded her from the inside out. I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix this, if it could even be fixed. I thought you wanted. She lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face turning toward me for the first time. Her eyes were hollow, empty, like all the light had drained from them. "You thought what?" she whispered, her voice raw, cracked, but filled with more pain than I had ever heard from her. "That I wanted this? That I wanted to be humiliated, destroyed like this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I had twisted her into something she wasn't? That I had pushed her into this nightmare because of my own sick need for control? There were no words that could undo the damage. No apology that could put her back together. "You wanted control," she said, her voice trembling, but gaining strength with each word. "You wanted to see me broken. Well, congratulations. You've done it. You've broken me. Are you happy now?" Her words sliced through me, each one sharper than the last. I had won, hadn't I? I had gotten everything I wanted. She was mine, completely and utterly destroyed by my hands. But looking at her now, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel powerful. I felt nothing. "Judy, don't," she snapped, cutting me off with a venom I hadn't heard from her in years. "Don't say another word." We sat there, the weight of her brokenness pressing down on both of us, suffocating the room in silence. I wanted to fix it, but there was nothing left to fix. I had pushed her too far, and now all I could do was watch her drift further away. Finally, after what felt like hours, she stood up slowly, her body stiff and shaky. She didn't look at me, didn't say another word. She just walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the aftermath of the destruction I had caused. I listened to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway, and then the soft click of the front door as it closed behind her. And just like that, she was gone. Everything was gone. The silence that followed after the door closed behind Judy was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was a void, a crushing emptiness that pressed down on me from all sides. The house, which had always felt too small, too filled with the noise of our constant battles, now seemed unbearably vast and desolate. The sound of my own breathing was loud in my ears, each exhale dragging out the reality I couldn't escape. I had won. I had broken her. And now, I was completely alone in the wreckage I had created. I stayed there on my knees for what felt like hours, staring at the floor, my mind racing but getting nowhere. There was no relief, no satisfaction. Just the echo of her last words ringing in my head, each one hitting harder than the last. "You've broken me. Are you happy now?" I had thought that was what I wanted. The control, the power, watching Judy bend to my will, knowing she was mine to command, to degrade. It had been thrilling, intoxicating even, the idea of holding her in the palm of my hand and making her do what I wanted. But now that it had happened, now that I had seen her shattered on the floor in front of me, the victory tasted like ash. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady as I made my way to the bed. The room felt too still, too cold, and I suddenly hated every inch of it. The bed where she had once lain beside me, where we had shared nights of intimacy and warmth, now felt foreign, unfamiliar. I collapsed onto it, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind replayed the events of the night in slow motion, the way she had trembled, the way her eyes had filled with tears, the way she had finally given in. The moment she broke, I had thought it would feel like a victory. I had thought it would give me that rush of satisfaction I'd been chasing for months. But all I felt now was an emptiness so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. I had pushed her too far. This wasn't just about control anymore. I had destroyed something far more fragile than her pride. I had destroyed us. I reached over to the nightstand, fumbling for my phone. My fingers shook as I scrolled through the contacts, finding Judy's name. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the call button, but I knew there was no point. She wouldn't answer. Not after tonight. Not after what I had done. But I called anyway. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I even say? Sorry? That seemed laughable now. There was no fixing this. No undoing the damage. I threw the phone onto the bed, my chest tightening with a mixture of regret and something I hadn't felt in years, shame. I had never considered myself the kind of man who would feel that, not after everything I'd done. But now, with Judy gone and the weight of my actions pressing down on me, it was impossible to ignore. I stood up again, pacing the room, trying to shake off the feeling that was crawling under my skin. I walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. The street outside was quiet, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere out there, Judy was walking away from everything we had built together. Walking away from me, and I didn't blame her. For years, I had chipped away at her, bit by bit, testing her limits, pushing her just a little further each time. I had convinced myself it was what we both needed, that the old spark had died, and this was the only way to bring something new into our lives. But now, looking back at it, I realized I had been lying to myself. This wasn't about reviving anything. It was about control, about feeding something dark inside me that I hadn't even fully understood. And now that it was over, that darkness was still there, but it felt like it was eating me alive from the inside out. I turned away from the window, suddenly feeling sick. I went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to shake the feeling that my own reflection was mocking me. The man staring back at me in the mirror looked older than I remembered. More tired, more defeated. I gripped the sides of the sink, my knuckles turning white, and tried to steady my breathing. But no matter how hard I tried, the images of what had happened wouldn't leave me. Judy on her knees, the tears running down her face, the way her voice had cracked when she told me I had broken her. I had wanted control. I had wanted power. But now, with all of it in my hands, I realized it had come at a cost I wasn't ready to pay. A knock at the door shattered my thoughts. It was soft, hesitant, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, it was Judy coming back. My heart leapt in my chest as I rushed to the front door, flinging it open with a kind of desperate hope I hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't her. It was Rick, standing there awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something close to guilt. He shifted on his feet, not meeting my eyes. "Look, man," he started, his voice low. I just wanted to check in. I don't know what that was, but it didn't feel right. I stared at him, still half expecting Judy to be behind him, but she wasn't. Of course she wasn't. "I thought she wanted this," Rick continued, glancing up at me with a frown. "I mean, you said she was into it, but I don't know, man. It didn't look like it." I couldn't find the words to respond. What was I supposed to say? Admit that I had lied? That I had pushed her into something she didn't want? Something she could never have wanted? Rick cleared his throat, shuffling awkwardly. "Anyway, I wanted to say sorry. I didn't mean for it to go like that. I thought it was all good." "Yeah," I muttered, my voice hollow. "It wasn't." Rick nodded, his discomfort palpable. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "You gonna be all right, man?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, staring at him, feeling that same crushing weight pressing down on me. "Take care," he said softly before turning and walking down the steps, disappearing into the night. I closed the door, the sound of it clicking shut echoing through the empty house. The emptiness felt unbearable now, like the walls were closing in on me. Judy was gone, and I was left standing in the hollow shell of the life I had destroyed, wondering how I had let it all slip away. The house felt like a tomb. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the windows, every shadow in the corners seemed to taunt me. There was no escaping the weight of it all, the decisions I had made, the darkness I had allowed to consume me, and the empty space Judy had left behind. It felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating me with the silence. I sat down on the couch, the same couch where Judy and I had spent countless evenings, where we'd once laughed together, argued, shared our lives. But those memories felt distant now, blurred by the haze of what I'd done. I could barely remember the last time we'd had a real conversation, one that wasn't laced with sarcasm or resentment. Somewhere along the way, we had both given up, but I was the one who took it to a place neither of us could come back from. I stared at the empty space where she had always sat, her favorite blanket still draped over the armrest, her slippers left carelessly by the edge of the rug. For a second, I imagined her walking back through the door, her face softening, her voice forgiving. But I knew that was impossible. What I had done was too great, too final. There was no coming back from it. The night replayed in my mind over and over again. I saw her on her knees, her broken smile, her tears. I heard Jason's voice, the hesitation in it, the way he'd questioned everything in that moment. I'd been so sure of myself then, so confident in the power I wielded. But now, in the stillness of the aftermath, I couldn't ignore the truth. I had crossed a line that no amount of time could erase. I had wanted control. I had wanted to feel that thrill of power, to watch Judy submit to my will. But it hadn't felt like power in the end. Felt like destruction. Destruction of everything I thought I controlled, and most of all of myself. My phone buzzed on the table, cutting through the silence. For a moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe it was Judy. Maybe she had calmed down and was ready to talk, to scream at me, to do anything but walk away. I grabbed the phone with trembling hands, but the name on the screen wasn't hers. It was Rick. Again, I almost didn't answer. I wasn't in the mood for his awkward attempts at reconciling what had happened, but something made me pick up the call. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the hollow need for some kind of human interaction in the void that had opened up in my life. Yeah, I answered, my voice flat, devoid of any real feeling. Rick's voice came through hesitant. Hey man, look, I've been thinking about what happened tonight. I don't think it's something we should just leave like this. Something was off and I think you know it too. I didn't respond. What was there to say? He was right, of course, but I wasn't about to spill my soul over the phone to him. Not now. Maybe not ever. Rick continued, filling the silence. What you did, what you asked her to do, it didn't sit right with me, man. I mean, we're all for having fun, but this wasn't that. You saw it. She wasn't okay. His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Hearing someone else say it out loud made the whole thing even more real, more grotesque. She wasn't into it, Rick said again, his voice firmer this time, and neither was I in the end. I know, I muttered, feeling the guilt twist tighter inside me. Rick sighed on the other end of the line, the sound heavy with the weight of something left unsaid. You need to fix this, or at least try to if you can. Whatever you've got going on in your head, man, this isn't the way to deal with it. I don't think there's any fixing this, I said quietly, almost to myself. She's gone. Rick didn't say anything for a few moments, the silence hanging between us like a cold, dead thing. Then he spoke, softer this time. Maybe she's gone for now, but you've got to try. You can't leave it like this. What you did, it's not something you can walk away from without trying to make it right. The words felt like a final blow. I had known deep down that Rick was right. I couldn't just sit here in this hollow, broken house and wait for things to go back to normal. There was no normal left. There was only the aftermath of what I'd done, and the slim chance that maybe, just maybe, I could find some way to make amends. But how? After hanging up with Rick, I sat there in the darkness, thinking. The house felt heavier than ever, each shadow reminding me of the choices I'd made, the lines I had crossed. My mind wandered back to Judy. Where was she now? What was she feeling? I couldn't imagine the depth of her pain, the betrayal I had inflicted on her. But I knew that if I didn't try to make things right, even in the smallest way, that guilt would consume me whole. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked to the front door. I didn't know where she had gone, but I knew where I could start looking. There was a small park a few blocks away, a place she liked to go when she needed to clear her head. It was where she'd gone after our worst arguments, and I had a feeling that's where she'd be tonight. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the world around me feeling eerily still. The streets were empty, the quiet hum of the city in the distance the only sound accompanying me as I walked. With each step, the weight of my actions pressed harder on my chest, but I kept moving forward. I needed to find her. As I approached the park, I scanned the benches and the pathways, my heart pounding harder with every step. And then I saw her. She was sitting on a bench, her back to me, her posture slumped in a way that made her look smaller, more fragile than I had ever seen her. She was alone, just staring out at the empty playground in front of her. For a moment, I stood there, frozen. What could I even say? How could I begin to apologize for what I had done? I had taken everything from her, her dignity, her trust, her sense of self. There was no simple apology for that, but I had to try. I walked up slowly, my steps hesitant, and sat down on the bench next to her. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence. She just kept staring ahead, her face unreadable in the dim light. For a long while, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us like a lead curtain. I didn't know how to begin, and she didn't seem willing to break the silence. Finally, I took a deep breath, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Judy, I'm sorry." The words felt pathetic, too small for the enormity of what I had done, but they were all I had. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She just kept staring ahead, her hands folded in her lap, her posture stiff and unyielding. "I don't expect you to forgive me," I continued, my voice breaking. "I don't even know if I deserve that, but I need you to know that I'm sorry, truly." Still, she said nothing. The silence stretched on, suffocating, but I stayed. I owed her that much. To sit with her, to face the consequences of my actions without expecting anything in return. And as the minutes passed, as the cold night air settled around us, I realized something that I had been avoiding all along. This wasn't about control anymore. This wasn't about power or fantasies or games. This was about the slow, painful process of understanding what I had destroyed. And maybe, just maybe, finding a way to start picking up the pieces.